So in my case, I taught my complex analysis class in the spring of 2017, and I had done some preliminary kind of proof of concept and design work in the summertime prior to that academic year, and then I had to sit on it until the spring. I was a little bit antsy. So first of all, let's just sort of go into this and talk about what it is I'm talking about. So a spherical camera is this thing, and so this is, there are several on the market. Ricoh is the brand that you want to get. There are other manufacturers that are making these, but they have very poor reviews. And if you go on Amazon and read a few of the reviews, you learn pretty quick. You just don't want to even go. They're just not there yet. They haven't evolved and I think Ricoh was really the first company to really invest heavily in developing their technology. And so this thing, this is a spherical camera. Sometimes they're called 360-degree cameras. As a mathematician, I don't like that phrase, of course, because, you know, math people are really interested in things that nobody else cares about. But, you know, it's 360 degrees, but it's also, I guess, 180 degrees this way. It's, you know, it's not just two-dimensional, right? It's three-dimensional, and so I prefer the phrase spherical camera. And so what we have here is two lenses and two sensors in opposing directions. And this lens is a super fisheye lens. And so it can see, I think it's 190 degrees for this lens, and then another 190 degrees. And so you add those two together, and you get more than half of a sphere on both sides. And so internally it stitches that together as a single image. So this is so what does the image look like? What can you do with the image? What do we talk about when we talk about spherical images? Well, if you've ever used Street View, you already know the answer. So I can here, if anyone wants to, you know, look at this thing, let's pass it around and, to see what it's like. You can hold it in your hand. The best way to take photos with it, I have found, is either on a tripod or as conspicuous and maybe self-consciousness inducing as it might be, the selfie stick. And the reason is, if you imagine this spherical camera is just sticking out on the end here, the selfie stick only presents this tiny little dime-shaped profile to the camera, and so it might as well be invisible in your photo. And you can hold it away from yourself so that half of the picture isn't your face, right? So this is, in the photo, it kind of looks like, you're floating above the table, is what it looks like in the photo. So this is, I found, the most useful tool, even if it kind of makes you self-conscious to wave it around, like I was doing in museums and so forth. So Google Street View, I think most of us are familiar with Google Street View. I mean, I could click and show you, but go ahead and go on your web browser and look at Google Street View, and you'll see what I mean.
Robert, excuse me.
Yeah, please, no, interrupt me anytime.
The Street View, Google Street, was Google kind of like the first to bring this out to the public?
You know, it seems to me that Google's support and Google's push for this technology for the purposes of enriching its Street View data drove this market for this camera. As far as I can tell, so Google loves Ricoh Theta cameras. Google has out-of-the-box support in Google Photos for the photos that the camera can take. Cameras, we're talking about the experience that you have with Google Street View, where you can click and drag and see all around you, and you can even drag and look at the ground, or look at the sky, or look behind you. And on mobile, for some apps, and I forget if this works for Google Street View or not, but if you move your app, the accelerometer in your camera is hooked into the display on the app, and you can look up and look down as if this is a view window into that alternate world where the photo was taken, right? So look down, you see the ground, look up, you see the sky or whatever. these images are really just regular JPG images, just like your cell phone takes. They're rectangular if you look at it on your computer without a spherical image enabled app. They just look like a weird looking, almost like a Mercator projection. It's actually very mathematically similar to a Mercator projection of the globe of the world, right? And so let me see if I can show you this. I have some photos on this already. So here it is without the, oh, there. Well, okay. So here it is. This right here is an example of an image that's not being rendered using the spherical photo, enabled rendering. And it looks, it's stretched out in the north and south poles and looks okay in the middle. So, on your computer, you can still look at these like any other photo, and you can edit them with like any other photo. You can use Photoshop to Photoshop out your tripod like I did. So here's one where I just photoed, if it'll do it with our internet connection here. So what I did is I just opened this JPG image file on my computer in Photoshop, and I took the tripod that was on the ground and I airbrushed it out with the smart airbrushing. What's the name of that tool? It's the smart airbrush tool, whatever its name is. So, but you really want some app that can display it, like a mobile app, or the web interface to Google Photos can do it out of the box. Facebook has support for spherical photos, so you can upload spherical photos to Facebook. Here I've taken some. This is really fun to take it down to the wet lab downstairs in this building in M&S. This is just in the basement here, and you see all of the equipment around you. And here we have some bubbling algae experiments. I think this is right below here. You see all this is just fun for me to look at. I have no idea what this stuff is, but it makes a good photo, right? I think this is Professor Marcy Marston's work below it. And then you might see some students every now and then with lab coats and goggles, like slicing up fish livers, and yeah.
That would be so cool for marketing too. Like
oh yeah,
on our university website.
So funny you should say that, because we do have that already on our university website.
Yeah.
If you click through the front page, well, it used to be. I should say it used to be, because we just recently switched over to our new design, but it's probably still there somewhere. And they only have maybe 4 or 5 images, though. They should put some more images up, just because why not?
Yes, why not?
Why not? Exactly. And I didn't realize that they had this. I would have stolen their images for some of the stuff that I did, but I took some of the same images because I took the places that they took photos of. They're interesting places on campus. So there's the center of the campus. That's my version. Their version, they had a much more expensive setup where they had multiple cameras and then shooting in different directions, and then they stitched it in software after the fact. Whereas the Ricoh Theta camera is a single device meant for the consumer, right? So I'm not paying $2,500 for just the rig alone, not counting the camera and the lenses, right? So their photos are a little bit higher quality than the one I could take, but ones that I can take they turn out really well, amazingly well, especially if you learn how to you learn these little tricks on how to use it. There's the HDR mode, there's the mode that minimizes the noise, there's these little, and you learn how to use it in different lighting situations. So when I say spherical photo, this is what I mean. So here this is a slide just saying that Facebook can do it. YouTube, so that camera, it doesn't just take still images, still photos, it can also take video. The video, I haven't been super impressed with the video. It's just barely not quite good enough. And so like what it's lacking is resolution. So even though technically speaking it's HD resolution, all of those HD pixels, all of those are spread out over the entire sphere, right? And so if you're looking at this on your screen, you're presumably looking at only a part of the sphere. Depending on which direction you're looking only at that part. And so there's a bunch of pixels that you're not seeing. It really needs just a little bit more resolution to have really, in my opinion, to have really satisfying images. The best way to view these are with a tablet. This is just an example here, a little video of what the tablet experience is like, and you can zoom out, zoom sort of all the way out in some sense, and just flick your finger, and the photo just rotates. It's a lot of fun just to play with it. Apart from any pedagogical benefit or sort of teaching technology or method or source of examples in a math class, it's just so much fun to use this, and students just like to take the photos. I'll tell you how I allow the students to do that. So this is I have a few slides in here that are probably less interesting to my target audience for this talk, just because I'm not necessarily interested in diving into the mathematics with you. I'm more interested in sharing with you how I use this with my teaching. But this kind of this is just a tiny little bit here, just to get us on the same page about like why I would even think of using this in a complex analysis class. So what you have, and you could, if it helps, you could think of longitude and latitude just like on planet Earth, on a globe. So if that helps, think of it that way. But for my math students, what I have here is these coordinates. We have radians here, so 0 from 2 pi radians instead of 0 to 360 degrees. And then we have sort of the I have to say it right, the latitude, right? The latitude this way is 180 degrees, or if you're in a math class, pi radians. And the reason why this is interesting for complex analysis students is because with complex numbers, you have a real part and an imaginary part. So with real numbers, a real number is just like the numbers that we're used to using. It's like the number 7, the number 2, the number 1.582946, pi, the square root of 7, right? All of these are real numbers. And they can be represented with a line, the real number line, just like from grade school. Well, complex numbers have a real part and an imaginary part, and so you have two real dimensions. That's how we say it. We have two real dimensions. And the imaginary part is basically a real number times the square root of -1. That's the simplified version. And so you can represent on the plane a single complex number using the two numbers, the real part and the imaginary part. So it's like a coordinate pair. So again, from high school math, maybe you have an XY plane, but now we have an X and an IY, imaginary Y plane, for numbers instead of just a single line. And what we do is we study functions that eat complex numbers and spit out complex numbers. And so in the simplest case, if you eat a two-dimensional number and spit out a two-dimensional number, you have somehow 4 dimensions at play. And so you can't draw a picture of 4-dimensional things. How do you draw that picture? In elementary school and high school math and in college math, we can draw pictures of functions of real numbers because you have the input and then you have the output, and you can draw the graph of, maybe it's a parabola, you can draw the graph of the parabola. But with complex functions that eat complex numbers, spit out complex numbers, you need something else. And so the something else is, what you're doing is you're taking numbers in a plane, in a two-dimensional plane, and you're kind of doing something to them as defined by whatever the function is, to put them somewhere else on the plane. So that's you kind of have to wrap your mind around it. That's the basic idea. But the punchline, all of that is really just to say we're dealing with something on a plane, right? Now, in the earliest history of complex analysis, when mathematicians were first starting to think about complex numbers and what they were useful for, the mathematicians, and a mathematician in particular named Bernard Riemann, noticed that we can map the plane to a sphere. We can sort of wrap up the plane into a sphere. And this is a picture of that idea, where here you have a point on the plane, and what you want to do is you want to associate to this point on the plane a point on the surface of the sphere. And so the way you do that is you start at the North Pole and you shine a laser pointer, right? You shine a laser pointer through the sphere, out of the sphere, and onto the plane. So far, so good. So and we do this in my class. I have my sphere. Where is it? Oh, anyway, you pick up the sphere, and I'll point my finger, and I say this is a laser pointer, and I'm pointing it, and imagine the beam of light going through, and it's going out of the sphere, and it's hitting the plane, right? And I have the table. I point at the table, and I say that's the point. And so the point the point where it leaves the sphere, and in this picture, that's right here. The point where the beam of light leaves the sphere is the point on the sphere that's associated to the point that it lands on the plane, right? And so this is kind of a weird, but once you see what's going on, it's simple, but it's kind of a weird way of mapping the plane, in the entire plane, onto the surface of the sphere. Okay. It is cool, right? And so imagine, and we study this in different ways in class. So imagine what happens if instead we have this point, instead of this point being in here, maybe it's like on the inside. So notice this plane is cutting my sphere in half right by the equator, right? So what happens if this point here is actually on the inside? So what point is it being mapped to? Well, what's happening is, you have your laser pointer at the North Pole, and the laser pointer, the beam of light actually hits the point on the plane first, and then continues on and hits the point on the sphere. And so what happens is the South Pole, the southern hemisphere of the sphere maps to the inside circle, and the northern hemisphere, look at the picture here, the northern hemisphere is going to map to points outside of this circle that cuts exactly on the equator. Does that make sense? Yeah?
When was this discovered?
Oh, mid 1800s. Yeah, mid 1800s. Now this model is really, really useful to mathematicians, but and let me tell you, there's a really simple reason. So imagine this point here. Imagine if it's further away, right? So it's maybe, I haven't drawn the entire plane here, but just imagine that the point on the plane that we're talking about is really far away. Well, the associated point on the sphere, just draw a straight line connecting it to the North Pole. The associated point on the sphere is closer to the North Pole, right? So keep doing that. Let your point on the plane get further and further and further away. In fact, take a limit as it goes on forever. Take a limit. What we'll have is a, quote, point at infinity. It's infinitely far away from the origin, right? It's infinitely far away from the center of the plane. And that point at infinity, quote unquote, if you're just on the plane, that's not really an idea you can get your hands on. What does that mean, the point at infinity? It's this abstract notion that doesn't have a real meaning. It's not a number, right? Because how many times in a math class, at least in my math classes, do I tell my students, infinity is not a number. You can't add infinity, subtract infinity. You can't do arithmetic with it. Infinity is a concept. And so my students know that mantra, even from previous courses before they get to me, they know that mantra. But if you have this sphere instead, if you think about the sphere, the point at infinity is now this concrete point. It's the North Pole. It's a concrete, specific point. You can point to it. It's this one. It's the North Pole point. That's the point at infinity. That's why it's useful to mathematicians. And so that's why we're studying it in complex analysis and why it's so useful to us. But it turns out that this spherical model, it's called the Riemann sphere because Riemann was the mathematician. So this spherical model doesn't exist in any of the undergraduate textbooks. No undergraduate textbooks use this model. And I think the reason is that it's hard to talk about this without having some physical object. If you're just reading pages of a book, and you don't have, someone with a PhD really trying to explain it to you and doing these hand motions and like making up these stories about a laser pointer going through a sphere. If it's just pages on a book, it's really hard to use that model to teach somebody what's going on. So I don't know of any undergraduate textbook that if the book even mentions it at all, it'll just be a footnote, or it'll just use the word in passing and not really explain it and not use it as a way of teaching something, even though it's really useful mathematically. So, we're in a different age now. We have spherical cameras. We have, at Roger Williams University, we're really lucky. We also have a large format printer that we can print research posters with and other things. And so we're able to print out maps, and I'll show you how I did that. But we can print out these maps to construct these physical models, and I brought some of them here. Physical models that we can hold in our hands and rotate in our hands and point at and draw on. So there's my chalkboard globe. Yeah, I thought it was so clever. I was so proud of myself for painting this globe with chalkboard paint. And then it turns out that this is all over Pinterest. That home decorating people love this idea, and you can buy them on the internet for reasonable prices. And so then I kind of I was a little bit deflated there. I thought I was really clever and everyone's doing it. It's trendy. I'm trendy. So here, I can draw on this. I can draw shapes on it. Here I've illustrated how the sphere maps to the plane, or how the plane maps to the sphere, vice versa. So here's the point 0, 0. It's at the South Pole. That's exactly the middle of the plane. And then we have a real axis and an imaginary axis. And if you can imagine the plane wrapping up around this, then you have, this is in blue, the point at infinity, right? I'm really excited about the point at infinity on this thing. So I use this in class, and I draw on this in class. It's a really nice way of illustrating this stuff. There are a few different ways of taking a spherical photo and mapping it to a flat space. One common way is to take what's called a cube map or a quad sphere. I don't think there's a real satisfying name for these, but this is a really common way to do it. For example, I think Google Street View does this. The spherical photos that we have on our campus tour on the university website, it stores its spherical images in this format, where you take your sphere here in this picture here. This illustrates it. You take your sphere and you project out. Imagine that this sphere is you're shining a light out from the middle of the sphere, and it passes through, and you're projecting the image onto a rectangle, a square cube. And so the sides of the cube are whatever image is being projected. That's the side of the cube. And then, when you do that, and then you unwrap the sides of the cube, what you get is this image to the left. So you can print this out on a printer, and then cut this up and fold the edges together and wrap it up, and it'll look like a kind of a funny looking globe. It's a box shaped globe, but all the image seams will match together, right? There are lots of different ways to do that, but that's one of the most common. Another common way is it's really the one I previously talked about, where we have the lines of longitude and latitude. That way of mapping it is also really common. There's software that helps you manipulate images. This is more if you're like me and you're a math teacher. So when I say that we have functions that map the plane to the input plane, I should say, maybe I could call it that, the input plane to the output plane. A function takes points on the input plane, does something to it, and sticks it on the output plane. So what this is doing here, and this is a website, it's out there on the internet, anyone can use this. It's just an HTML page with some JavaScript embedded in it, and it's great. I love this thing. A mathematician, David Bowe, made this. I'm super impressed. I sent him an email telling him how much big of a fan I am of him. Um, so this, let's say we want to use the z-squared function. Now, in complex analysis, instead of doing f of x, x is the real variable, we do f of z, and it's just tradition, but we use z to say it's a complex number instead of a real number or a real variable. And so just like we have f of x equals x squared, if you remember back in your days when you studied mathematics, you have f of z equals z squared, you can do the same kind of thing. And so here I can illustrate this to my students. You know, what is it doing to points on the plane? How is it changing it? How is it stretching or shrinking, or like what kind of operation is the z-squared function? And so this is really nice to study these functions. So we can distort and twist the plane in this way. Now, this is math stuff. I'll sort of zoom past this a little bit. If you're a math instructor, this is really nice, but maybe you're a history instructor, right? And you want to use this because you're looking at historical context or something of that nature. This is, again, sort of technical here. So there's Mathematica has support for these kinds of images, and there's some really simple commands. You don't necessarily have to be a computer programmer. You just need to be able to copy and paste from the internet, really, to manipulate spherical images. So Mathematica is free for anyone on campus here. I built my own tools in Mathematica where I could just share a document with my students, and they didn't need to know how to code stuff. All they needed to do was know how to use my code, which was simple. You just say the name of. So I made a piece of code that took their spherical photo and made a map that they could cut out of paper and build a model. And so all they needed to know was the name of that function. So, you know, make spherical map, and they put their photo inside, and that's it. That's it. So I could just share that as a document to them. Really easy to use. I wish there was more easily accessible software from a sort of beginner technical side of things, where some of our science students or computer science students could just write very easily, write short little programs to do this stuff. Some sort of nascent pieces of this exist, but it'd be really nice if I could have just a little bit of time to you know, put something together that students at other places could use that would be easy. It was just not enough time. For math students, there's some really nice short introductions to the mathematics of this. And some of my own course materials I've shared with the world. I intend to put a lot more stuff out there. And I've put all of my slides up on the web as a sort of progress toward my goal of putting everything up. So that I've dumped as many resources and links and course materials into my slides as I can. So if someone comes across my slides, they can find it. And so these are sort of some math resources. There's a textbook here that uses computers and complex analysis. I don't know that it uses spherical images because this book was written and published before really these kinds of devices were accessible. You know, something that I forgot to mention is how much does this device cost? And the answer is it depends on what generation you're purchasing. The first generation camera costs about $200. The second generation costs about $300. At least it did. They recently put out the third generation device in the last couple of months, maybe. And so I don't know how that's adjusted the pricing. I'm not sure what the latest and greatest device can be bought for. I'm not exactly sure what the price of that is. But it used to be about $200, $300. So it puts it into the sort of reachable realm of an adventurous professor who's trying to experiment with stuff like this. I'll skip this, even though it's just super, super cool. I'm going to skip it because it's more specific to math stuff. Because I'm sort of looking at the time. I want to make sure that I get to what I did for my teaching. What can you do with this in terms of teaching things? So what I did Now, I use technology in a few different ways in this course. This is just one of the pieces of technology I used, but I also used Mathematica to do some demos in class, and I had my students use LaTeX, which is a mathematical typesetting system, so that they could learn the tools of the profession. So what I had is I had mini projects. So mini projects were meant to be the same time and energy commitment as, roughly speaking, 2 homework assignments. And so mini projects, I had 3 of them throughout the semester, and they were very open-ended. And not everything in the course went super, super well. Whenever you experiment with stuff like this, some stuff is amazing and like you really hit the nail on the head, and other stuff you realize, you need to rethink that next time around. And so the open-endedness of my projects here really challenged them, because they struggled with what I wanted. What did I want from them? And I felt like I did a good job explaining it, but you don't always really understand what the students perceive. So I had to do a lot of encouraging students to come to my office hours so that we could hash things out and brainstorm together. And I wrote some detailed guidelines and put it on bridges. And so that was one of the areas where I think next time around I would try to give them more structure so that they were less panicked about what I was asking them to do. And so what we would do is, whenever a topic came up where an interesting mini project might exist in that topic, we put it on a list on Bridges. We had a wiki on Bridges where we just added it to the list. And so as the semester went on, we had a longer and longer list of things, and students could pick from those, or a student could make something up on their own. And then we had a larger group project where students worked in groups of 2 or 3, mostly in groups of 2, but there's one or 2 groups of 3, I forget. I think just 1 group of 3. And so they had to, the assignment was to write something that looked like a section from a textbook on one of the topics that we studied. But it wasn't supposed to be exactly what we studied. They were supposed to find some different twist on it, or maybe expand it, or find something that wasn't exactly the same as we talked about. It was just maybe going off of what we talked about. So the idea was, your audience is your peers, your classmates. And so you're writing the textbook section for your classmates. And we are actually going to use it to learn that material in class. And so the next part of this project was, and also you're going to do the lecture. So you're writing the section in the textbook, and you're writing the lecture for that topic, and you're going to give that lecture to your classmates, right? So you see how this is going, is where now I'm putting them in the role of the teacher. And so they have to think about what's a good way to understand the material, and what's a good way to present it. And so I also had them do a research poster. And so the research poster is, and I gave them a very detailed requirements on Bridges, and I gave them a template of the poster that I swiped from. I think Bob Cole sent it to me that we use it at SASH. I got that. And so I coached them on how do you make a research poster. But the idea was that they were going to use the images and photos and projections that they took with the camera. They're going to use that on their poster to illustrate their mathematical idea. And finally, the last part of the project was they need to make a physical model somehow. Now here I have 2 physical models that students made. This one, the student, so each group, I gave them at least a week. We had a lot of time, the students had a lot of time to take the camera to their favorite places. And that took a little courage on my part, that I was giving them this, like, this is my toy, but I bought it for this purpose. I bought it so that students could use it. So I gave the group the camera, and they were very good with it. They were very respectful of it. And they took it to lots of interesting places. This student took it to an art store and took some photos in this art store. This one's only partially assembled because I disassembled it because I wanted to take it to a conference and show people at the conference. So she took photos at the art store, and then she applied a mathematical function to it. And so remember, this is we could think of this as a photo all covering the whole plane, right? So this is the whole plane wrapped up to the sphere. So the function that takes parts of the plane to parts of the plane, you could also think of it as taking parts of the sphere to parts of the sphere. So these functions, they rearrange the sphere, they stretch the sphere, they do things to the image that's on the surface of the sphere here. So her picture of the art store, she mapped it using her particular function that she was studying to get this. And this is interesting. If you notice, I'll pass this around. There's actually 2 copies of everything. There's 2 copies of, so this, you can see a little art man over here. There's two of them. Okay, so if you're interested, I'll pass that around. This is a photograph, a spherical photograph of the set of the TARDIS that an artist had on the internet. So I'm not going to put it online because there's probably some copyright thing about that. But it's a really cool spherical photo that this artist has on his portfolio on the internet. And so my student took that photo and did a transformation on that spherical photo of the TARDIS. And so this is what her function looks like after rearranging the TARDIS. And so this one's fun. This one is more or less put together. We haven't stuffed it yet. That's the only thing that we haven't done, but that's that one. Most of the groups made a sphere like that. They had a function they were studying. They made the sphere. One group made a half sphere because that group, Ashley Crane and Jess Mancina, they were studying hyperbolic space and hyperbolic geometry, which is the fascinating stuff that connects really beautifully with complex analysis. And so it made more sense for them to make a half of a sphere where you could see the inside had part of a photo and the outside had a part of the photo. The great part of this, the thing that worked so well with this from a teaching perspective, was students would explain to each other, would explain to different groups, would explain to me as the professor, and then ultimately would explain to just regular, the normals, right? So people who weren't in the math class, I should say, right? No, people who weren't math students, right? People who weren't math experts, just their classmates who may have been history majors, or their teachers who might be a biologist, or anyone who was just walking around in sash. And it was amazing from my perspective as the instructor. It was amazing to see them go through this process of barely having the words to even talk about their subject to increasing levels of sophistication, where at the end of it, it was so clear that they really understood what they were talking about and what they had studied. But not only that, they were able to explain it in very simple language and in very simple terms to someone who didn't already understand. It was just such a cool thing to see. And I talked to them, I made this explicit with them when we went throughout the course. I was like, you guys, do you feel like you're getting better at explaining this? And they would say, yeah, oh man, absolutely. I mean, they were just so effusive about that process. It was such a success in my view. But I am now even more convinced. I was already convinced, but I'm even more convinced now that requiring some kind of mathematical communication or mathematical illustration is such a powerful teaching tool, because it was such a success in my students, and they had fun doing it. It's a fun thing to take their own pictures and to build their own models. They might have been a little bit nervous to present, but they got over it because I made them do it so many times. They really gained some confidence.
How big was your class?
Yeah, so it was pretty small. It was 10 students.
That's a good manageable.
It was a manageable size, so I had 5 groups, right? And so it was only, and I had to schedule it, but it was only 5 weeks where we would trade off. And the ones who had the camera last, well, they would just schedule their presentation last, right? And the posters were due at the end of the semester, more or less. So it was a manageable thing. The thing that made the physical models work really well was our access to the large format printer. I could print off these projections really nicely, and Jim Lemire would do that for me. I would get him the next day. He was just so great with that. So that, these models, that's not the only way to make these models. You could do it so that it's just on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. There are other ways to map that to something that you could cut out and assemble. But this is the way that I found worked well when I was experimenting before, during the summertime when I was trying to work out these details. Yeah. Any other questions or wondering about anything?
I wonder how many of you students are going to go out and buy their own camera like that just for
my dad did, and he's my dad. Because I would bring my camera home. I would bring it over Christmas and take photos of the family, and it was just such a fun. My dad broke down and bought it, and then he bought another one when the new one came out. So now he has the latest and greatest. And he's not a math guy at all, and he's not writing his own computer programs or anything. It's just for fun for him. But yeah, that's a good question.
I was pleased to see I got a chance to go to your student presentations at the end of the semester, last semester, at how enthusiastic the students were in explaining to me. And some of them even took their model apart and showed me how they cut it and how they reformed it and explained to me why they did it the way they did it and why they chose that subject. And they were all like so excited about it.
It was so good to see that. I was so pleased with how well they did there.
Yeah.
I tipped off the Marcom people, and I said, "Hey, we're doing this cool thing. It has some nice visuals. Come and check it out." And so they came and they sent a photography down, and the photographer, oh man, what was his name? He was so good. He talked to my students. He wasn't a technical person at all, but he talked to my students and asked such great questions, and my students were so excited to talk to him. And so that was, watching that was great too. That it was really satisfying as an instructor to see that.
They said it was such a fun way to study math.
Yeah.
Just having the ability to manipulate and it really helped them understand what's going on.
Right. And now, despite my sort of, all of these superlatives I'm using here, it did stretch them because I made it very open-ended, and they had to do a lot of intellectual work to end up where they ended up. And so a lot of the students, they push back, right? They push back. I mean, this is not a new story. I'm not telling you guys anything that you haven't seen with your own eyes. And I think there were. I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't rough patches. I think there were bugs, but I tried to be very open about the fact that, look, guys, this is the first time I'm trying this. There's going to be some bugs. There's going to be a little bit mistakes, and I want you guys to make sure that you tell me, what's working and what's not. But at the end of the semester, the most common piece of feedback I got was really related to the lack of structure, where they had to think of their own thing to do. And I think maybe it's hard to judge, but I would say half of that is because I did make them think of their own thing to do, and that's a good thing, right? So half of that is just a product of me sort of stretching them in a positive way. The other half of it, I probably could have given them more structure. I think maybe I sort of I gave them too few details, and I think that's something that I'll change next time I teach it. I'll give them more fine-grained rubrics to follow, and maybe show them some examples of the kind of thing that they might be able to do without telling them that you have to do it this way. Just sort of give them maybe a little bit more structure to make them feel more comfortable about it. Yeah.
And these are what students, sophomore and junior?
It was a hard class to teach because I had a range. I had graduating seniors and I had sophomores down to the sophomore levels. But the sophomores, I mean, they were strong math students. They were sophomores who were math majors who had taken a lot of math classes. But still, there's a mathematical maturity that you get when you go along in the math major. So I tried. This is where the groups really serve the students well, because the more senior students can teach and bring along the more junior students, even in ways that I can't as the instructor, because I'm so far away from being an undergraduate at this point in my life that I've forgotten some of the things that make it hard. But I had the gamut. Yep.
But you applied Missoura's peer instruction model.
Yeah. Yep.
To overcome that. Which
Yeah.
I think that's really effective.
Yeah, and I think it worked. I think it did. There were moments in the class that that I covered some what might be considered remedial material for what this course is about. But what I found was that even the senior students didn't mind that so much. I maybe had one comment from one student who had wished I would have gone a little bit faster and more in depth. But I think even most of the senior students thought that was kind of nice to see it again and just have that refresher. So, yeah. But I can imagine lots of applications that have nothing to do with math. If you're a history teacher and you want to take a photo of the inside of some historical location, or if you're an architect, and you're teaching architectural students, you could look at different structures in different ways. You can look at different kinds of perspective. I think there was an element of creativity that the students really enjoyed about manipulating the images in weird ways, using these functions that they liked. So maybe there's an artistic side of this that I'm probably less qualified to think about. But one of my colleagues in the sciences, he does stuff with GIS, with maps, and he says that this is a really great thing. In fact, I gave him the giant globe over there because I didn't want it in my office anymore. I made it too big. It was an experiment and it worked, and I'm kind of bummed out that it worked because now I have this huge object. But I gave that to him, and he uses it to demo in his class things about the globe and about the spherical projections onto flat surfaces. So. It's perfect for math. There's lots of different math applications, geometry and complex analysis and other kinds of things. But I think it could work in lots of different settings. Lots of different settings could use this. Physical models work in lots of different ways, right? So, and presentation and so forth. Like these elements are I think very widely applicable to a variety of things.
Camera technology has been used to create virtual field trips,
yeah.
virtual tours on the web.
Yeah.
So, like, you can actually explore the Great Wall of China.
Yes.
And you can hear people talking around
Yeah.
you. I mean, you're actually there. And
it's amazing.
Fascinating. And you can go through the Louvre. And
Yeah.
You can see all of
Yeah.
that. It's just
it's so great. Yeah. So the latest generation of that device has 3D audio. It has some 3D microphone technologies built into it, and I haven't played with one, so I don't know how that adds to the experience. But it's exciting to think about where we're headed, right? I mean, even if it doesn't work well, eventually it will, right? Eventually we'll have that, and
I think I can tell what you want for Christmas.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm a little bit concerned because the latest generation is getting negative reviews, and I'm wondering if they rushed it to market. But it might be a software thing, that the software wasn't ready. So, and they'll fix it. I'm happy with that one. That one's really great. The only complaint I have is the video just isn't quite there. Just barely, not really very good. It can hold a lot. I forget exactly, but I've never run out of storage. It can take. It's limited on how much. It can take 24 minutes of video, and the limitation is thermal. It gets too hot. But the battery lasts for a long time. I took it on vacation, and I'd have it all day long, basically. It's just USB, so USB chargers are ubiquitous these days. But it has way more storage than you'll ever run out. You'll need to recharge the battery long before you'll need to remove the images.